Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about marketing metrics and more specifically, how to go through a process of choosing more meaningful and impactful metrics that actually line up to the business objectives of your campaign. So over the years, I've worked with a lot of marketers, and one of the things I've noticed is that they can sometimes struggle to choose metrics that really matter. And usually that's because they don't have a framework in place that helps guide them through a process of metric selection. So in this video, I'm going to show you a metrics planning framework that I've developed over the years that you can use for your own campaigns and which will help you choose better metrics. Okay, so first thing to know about, I'm going to be going through both the concepts of the framework, but also I'm going to be giving you access to templates you can use. And all of this is done on a tool called Miro. Now, Miro is a really cool visual collaboration and planning tool. You can go and create an account on Miro, and you can create up to 3 boards for free, so you don't actually have to pay. So you can easily go and duplicate the template that I'm about to show you. So let's jump on over to Miro. Okay, so this is Miro. And if you've never used the tool before, how it works is you have this big canvas. So you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can add text, you can add shapes to create diagrams and things like that. It also has this sticky notes if you're having some kind of whiteboarding session or something like that, which is actually going to be quite important to this board template I'm going to walk you through. So generally, Miro is really good for just kind of visual mapping. And by the way, if you are curious now about how you can actually duplicate this board with a free Miro account, there's a link in the description about how you can do that. So first things first, I developed this planning framework mostly from my own experiences as I worked at ad agencies where I was often working in a team setting. So I'd be working with other people on a part of a campaign at an agency for an end client. That client could have been like Unilever or Nike or someone else. And oftentimes we'd be in kind of a planning session or a scrum or a war room with like myself plus a project manager, a creative, a UX designer, a developer, and we'd all be working together to make the campaign come together. And there would often be a point where we talk about metrics planning. So this process I'm going to walk you through is designed around a collaborative kind of setting. You can do it solo if you want, but it does work well in a group setting. So let's get started. Now, before we start getting into thinking about metrics, the really important thing to remember is that metrics and things you measure always have to connect back up to your business objectives. And when it comes to marketing, I find that there's generally 5 common business objectives, which are these ones here. So sometimes the objective of your campaign is to drive brand, product, or service awareness. Let's say you have a brand new product that you're about to launch. Nobody knows about it. You're not going to be driving sales from day one. So the first thing you got to do is get people to be aware of the product. And so sometimes your campaigns are really just about driving awareness. Other times you can have campaigns where the objective is achieving brand, product, or service positioning. So what does this mean? Sometimes you might have a product that has healthy awareness, but people don't really understand your unique selling proposition or your key benefits relative to competitors. And so this kind of campaign will really be about education, really pushing out specific marketing messaging that relates to why your product is so great, what are some of the benefits that it'll have for you, how is it relative to competitors. So a positioning campaign is really about making people understand how you're different or how your product or service is going to make their lives better. The third one is a campaign designed around fixing a broken reputation. This is where you are trying to repair a branding crisis. And a great example of this is Samsung's exploding phone crisis with the Note 7, which is probably one of the biggest brand recalls I've ever seen, but also one of the biggest brand recoveries I've seen in the course of the year, because the Note 8 ended up being one of their best-selling phones only a year after the crisis that was the Note 7. And they had to repair their brand, and they did it very quickly. One of the things they did was they took out full-page ads, and I think it was like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, where they basically apologized for what had happened. And they tried to start getting on the right foot, gaining the trust of their customers again. In that kind of campaign, they're not trying to drive leads. They're not trying to drive awareness because everyone already knows about Samsung. They're trying to repair a brand that is in crisis. And hopefully you don't have to be in this position, but these kind of campaigns do exist. So the fourth type of campaign is a consideration campaign. This is where you're trying to keep your brand or your products or services top of mind. And generally what I find is that these types of campaigns, you're going after very targeted segments of your target audience. And the types of advertising you're doing are going to be very, very tactical to making your brand kind of top of mind for the next time someone's going to be in the market to buy your types of products or services. Now, this generally applies mostly to brands with longer buying cycles. Take insurance and cars. Generally, you're not buying those things every week or every month. You're going to be buying those on like an annual basis or on a 5 or 10 year basis. And so a consideration campaign is very relevant to these types of product categories because they have to get people to think about the next time they're going to make that purchase way down the road, think about my brand. So it's about making your brand top of mind, and it's about playing a longer strategic game. During the pandemic, you had a lot of companies, particularly in the B2B space, give their services away for free. Companies like Zoom that were giving away their software for free, not just the brands, but the everyday people. And I do believe that they were doing this because it was the right thing to do. But I also think that this was a very strategic decision because when the pandemic was over, when it came time to actually buying the software, Zoom was in a very good position to get people to stay with them and actually start paying for the software. So Zoom in that case was also making a very long-term play to get people to think about them the next time they had to make that purchase. And finally, you have conversion campaigns. This is where you're trying to drive sales or leads. If you're a B2B company, you're not going to be making $500,000 transactions over the web. Sometimes you need to capture leads on your site, pass them to a sales force, and then convert them over a sales cycle. So conversions are not just about sales or e-commerce. They can also be things like white paper downloads, newsletter signups, and things like that. But they need to be creating some kind of business value. So those are the 5 common types of marketing campaigns. And the thing is, you don't always have to have one. You can have multiple objectives, but you're always only going to have one primary objective where you're putting most of your effort into. So for example, you might have a campaign where you're launching a new product and the primary objective is awareness, and maybe a secondary objective is to position the product, and a tertiary objective could be just to drive some leads. It's a nice to have, but it's not essential. So what I'm saying here is that if you have a campaign with multiple objectives, just know that those objectives are not all going to be equal. There should usually be one core objective. Okay, we've covered business objectives. Now let's think about metrics. And generally there are 4 aspects to a metric that you need to think about. The first is the metric type, and there are 3 types of metrics that I refer to. The first is a platform metric, also known as off-the-shelf metrics. These are metrics that you can just get from your metrics tool off the shelf. They're readily available. So in Google Analytics, you've got things like users and sessions and average time on site. Those are all readily available. You don't have to do anything. Those are platform metrics. Then you have in blue here are derived metrics. These are where you take 2 or more metrics that already exist and you kind of mash them together. A great example of that is like a conversion rate or an engagement rate. To calculate those kind of things, you need a numerator and a denominator. You need to divide something into another thing. So take conversion rate, for example. Generally, you would take total conversions, let's say leads, and divide that into something else like users on your site. And you're just taking 2 metrics and creating a new metric, which is derived from the 2. Engineered metrics are something special. These are metrics that you need to create from scratch. You need to engineer them. It's sometimes also referred to as instrumenting or instrumentation. That's where you're identifying some kind of action or behavior that you need to capture, and then you need to go and create that mechanism to measure it. Google Analytics, for example, has different ways for you to create new metrics that you can track within the tool. A great example I like to give is actually something not grounded in marketing, but think of like a Fitbit, for example, or a pedometer, which is something you put usually on your wrist, and it can track how many steps you take in a day. I love that example because the steps that you take, it's a metric that's always there. It's just invisible, and you needed this device to be able to harness that data. And that's what engineering metrics is all about. It's about thinking creatively about something you could measure that could be valuable, and then creating the means to actually capture that. Now, this gets a little technical, and generally, if you're not that technical, you're going to need the help of your data engineering or your data analyst team or your web ops team or someone who's a little bit more technical that can help out with this stuff. Okay, the second aspect is the metric format. This one's pretty straightforward, but metrics all have different ways of presenting themselves. Sometimes you have numbers. So this could be something like user sessions or 100 transactions or 50 likes. Then you have metrics that are percentages, a bounce rate or an engagement rate. You have duration-based metrics, so that's time-based, so it could be 27 seconds or 5 minutes and 20 seconds. Then you've got currency metrics, so Often if you're tracking transactions in e-commerce, you could have things like $100 or things like that. And finally, you have ratio metrics. A great example of where you'll see this is if you have a YouTube channel, how they report on engagement. They give you a like to dislike ratio. So ratio metrics are probably going to be a little bit less common, but they do show up from time to time. The third aspect, and this is where things get really important, is the metric category. This is where you can organize your marketing metrics in terms of their purpose. And there are 6 types of marketing metrics that I generally use. And just to let you know in advance, you don't have to use all 6 of these for every campaign or every channel. You're generally going to have a few of these for each channel, and maybe in a campaign, you won't use all 6 categories. So first of all, exposure metrics measure essentially reach. So things like website sessions, users, ad impressions, Facebook reach, all measure exposure. Engagement metrics deal with how many people interacted, responded to, or engaged with your content. This could be something like a like, a comment, a click-through rate, or an engagement rate. Perception metrics measure affinity for your brand or your content or your products or services. This is where you have things like maybe comment sentiment that you can tag yourself manually, or use a tool like Sprinkler or Sprout Social to help measure that sentiment. But the nice thing is you also have some metrics that explicitly tell you about the sentiment, like likes versus dislikes. A like is kind of an explicit measure of affinity for something. People are liking something. And perception metrics are really valuable because just tracking engagement doesn't always tell you the full story. Remember the story of Samsung I told earlier. When the stories of the exploding batteries started, if you went to their Facebook page, they probably had really high engagement rates, but not for the right reasons. They would have had people probably hating on the brand and raging out. And so sometimes engagement rates, just look at them by themselves, don't really tell you everything. And if you contrast engagement rates to perception metrics, then you get the full story. Experience metrics, these are metrics that are only relevant to platforms that you own and have access to first-party data like Adobe or Google Analytics or some kind of analytics tool. For example, Facebook, you don't have access to things like the average time it takes to load your page. So you're not going to have experience metrics for Facebook, but you will for your app or website. And these are things like app or page load times, crash reports, crash rates, and things like that. So why is it good to have a handful of experience metrics in your campaign? Well, the reason is if you have a big campaign where you're using Facebook and Twitter ads to drive awareness or traffic to a special page on your website, and you've driven 2 million impressions across your paid posts, but those resulted in only 3 conversions on your website. Generally, when you see an underperforming campaign like that, you'll start trying to figure out what's going on. And the first place you usually go to is the creative strategy or execution. Are the calls to action actually working? Is the creative actually resonating with the users? Which is great, because sometimes that is part of the problem. But there are other cases where sometimes a bad experience might be driving that underperformance. In that same scenario that I just painted, imagine that the average load time for that page was 5 minutes. That might be a reason why you only got 3 conversions out of those 2 million impressions. So experience metrics allow you to ensure that underperformance isn't the result of some kind of technical error, and it allows you to focus on the creative issues if those are actually the problem. Acquisition metrics are those things like cost per that you've probably heard about. So cost per lead, cost per impression, cost per click, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I often refer to these as cost of doing business metrics. And I sometimes see people conflate these as ROI or as conversion metrics. They're not. These are very important metrics, but what they tell you about is the efficiency of your spending. So for example, if you run a whole bunch of ad campaigns and you know that your average cost per click is 50 cents and you run a new campaign and it's $2, you know that either something's wrong or you're just targeting a really niche target audience. So acquisition metrics, generally very good to include. They're really they're like a diagnostic. They're just telling you how efficient your spending is. And finally, you have conversion metrics. These are kind of your end of the funnel actions. They're things like transactions, conversions, conversion rate, et cetera. And you can see I've written a little note here. Some metrics aren't necessarily exclusive to one category. So for example, a like, which is we covered already as an engagement metric, is also a good proxy for brand sentiment. So a like could also be a perception metric as well. So it's not like every metric fits squarely into one category. They can fall across multiple categories. Okay, the third aspect we need to think about is the metric role. And the metric role really deals with how important the metric is. And there are two types of roles. There are hygiene metrics, which are metrics that you should be tracking as part of your campaign that are important. And then you have key performance indicators, or KPIs. These are kind of like your North Stars. They're really, really important metrics that really tell you about overall success of your campaign or failure. And generally, when it comes to KPIs, it really, again, depends on how many channels and how big your campaign is. But I generally say aim for 3 to 5 KPIs, or if your campaign's really big with lots of channels, no more than 10 overall. And then your hygiene metrics, aim for 5 to 10, but no more than 20. Between your hygiene metrics and your KPIs, you could have between 8 and 20 metrics that you're reporting on. This does not mean these are the only metrics you'll ever report on. You could have this big reporter dashboard where you'll have lots of other metrics. These are the important ones. Think of these as the ones that show up at the top of your dashboard or on the first 2 pages of a PowerPoint deck that reports on campaign performance. So hygiene metrics and KPIs are just the really important ones. We make this distinction between these two because KPIs are the ones that you are really clearly saying these are the clear indicators of success, but these hygiene metrics are also things that I think I need to report on as well. So to summarize the 4 aspects, we have the metric types, the format, the metric category, and finally the role. And now we're going to start building the planning board. So here is our planning board. You can see here every channel has its own lane. So we've got Facebook, then maybe have another channel, which is my website, my app, my newsletter. So every channel will have its own lane. And you can see one column for each of the metric categories: exposure, engagement, perceptions, experience, acquisition, and conversion. And what you're going to do here is you're going to grab the sticky notes that correlate to the different metric types. Remember, there are 3. The orange ones are your platform metrics. The blue ones are your derived metrics, and the green ones are your engineered metrics. And what you're going to do is you're just going to go through here by yourself or as a team, just start coming up with ideas, things you can measure. What are metrics that you know about? What are metrics that you think you might want to measure at the intersection of the channel and the category here? And a couple of things you will notice. First of all, like I mentioned before, you don't have metrics in every single category for each channel. And you can either just leave this blank, but optionally, sometimes what I like to do is you can double click on this little grid section here and just make it a darker color. Again, it's fine if you leave it blank, but if you just want to make it clear to people that this doesn't apply to this channel. This template is made very easily, so you can just stack on additional lanes for new channels, or you can delete them. So if you don't need that channel, let's say you only have 3 channels, you can easily add or remove channels. What you're also going to do for each channel is add the name and the data source. The data source is important because it's telling you where you're going to get this metric from. And you might say, well, isn't there only one source? Not necessarily. Let's say you're using a social media management tool like Sprinkler or Sprout Social. You can get data from that tool, or you can go all the way back to the source like Facebook Page Insights. It's important that you decide where you're going to pull that data from. And that's why we indicate the data source here. And so one other thing to mention with this is that it's okay to have a lot of metrics. If you go through this and you have, 5 channels and you end up having like 50 metrics on this board, that's okay. The purpose at this stage is for you to think creatively about what you can and should measure. So it's okay for you to have a lot of sticky notes on this board at this point. So let's actually go through a real case study and see what the board might look like based on a specific scenario. So in this case, the case study, you're going to imagine that you are a brand manager at the company Akamai. That's actually a real company. If you're not familiar with them, they're a B2B company that work in the global cloud service and cybersecurity space. They sell things that kind of make the internet work. And in this case, imagine you're launching a campaign where you're launching a new product or new service. It's a video streaming security service offering. You're selling it to B2B players like, say, video hosting sites. There are generally 3 objectives, which I've summarized here. The primary objective is awareness, because again, in this case, nobody knows about this new product. So we're launching a brand new product. Primary objective is to drive awareness. And then we have the secondary objective, which is positioning, which is to help people understand, well, what is this? What are the core features of this product offering? How is it different from the competitors? And finally, a tertiary objective is conversions. In this particular case, we'll track leads that we generate from this campaign, but it's not really a core focus. And in this case, it's going to be leads because this is expensive software. Generally B2B, big B2B subscriptions, you don't convert people, with a credit card online. You track, you generate, capture those leads, you hand them to a sales force, and they'll eventually go and convert those leads. So this is our metric board here, and you can see there are a lot of channels in this campaign. So we've got like a main brand website, but we also created this additional product microsite just for the campaign. You've got a YouTube channel where we put videos about the product. We've got a CRM tool for capturing the leads. In this case, we're going to be using some sponsored content. That's where we pay like a media owner to be able to publish content on their site about our brand. So we're paying for kind of news coverage. Then you've got things like banner advertising, aka display ads, and LinkedIn ads. And finally, you've got things like PR, where you can write press releases, pitch it out to journalists. And you've also got Google Search. This is where we're tracking how well our website and products are ranking in search. And we're going to use a tool called Moz, which is a great search tool. And you'll notice that we've dropped in metrics for each of those channels across different metric categories. I've grayed out the categories here that are less relevant. And another thing you'll notice is that naturally, because this campaign focus is awareness, there's actually a lot more metrics under exposure. That's normal. If your campaign objective was conversion, you might see more metrics under the conversion tab. It really does depend. Now, a couple of things also to point out here. First, you see a lot of metrics here. That's okay. And we're not at the point where we're shortlisting our KPIs or hygiene metrics yet. That's coming next. So it is okay to have a lot of metrics. This is kind of like a whiteboarding session. We're just kind of still brainstorming at this stage. The other thing something that's very important to point out, though, is sometimes you'll have a metric that will require two different data sources. So take a conversion rate here, which is a derived metric. Conversion rate is often cited, but seldom understood. And there are infinite ways you can calculate conversion rates. Now, let's say we are generating leads on our website, so people go out and fill out a form. And so a conversion in this case is a lead. The question is, well, what do you divide leads into? And it's really open-ended. You could divide leads into lots of different things. How many people landed on the form? How many users landed on the website? In this case, what I've decided to do is divide the leads into the unique users who landed on my brand product microsite. But in this case, what I've done is optionally, you don't have to do this, I have indicated that this conversion rate metric is calculated by dividing into users. So it's just indicating what other source is being used to calculate this. Now, the question is, where do you put the conversion rate sticky? What I suggest, and I've written about here, is that you place it in the channel lane for the numerator. That's the number on the top of your fraction. So in this case, we're dividing leads into users to calculate conversion rates. So we're going to drop the derived sticky note for conversion rate into the channel for the leads, which in this case is the CRM platform. So that's just some guidance on, if you do have cross-channel metrics, put the sticky note into the channel that corresponds with the metric that's on the top of your fraction, the numerator. So another thing you can do next here, and this is also optional, is that once you have all your metrics, you can also indicate the metric format. So is it a number, a percentage, a duration, a currency, a ratio? This is useful, particularly if you and your team are newer to measurement and you're trying to guide your stakeholders towards why you're making certain decisions around what to measure. This is really helpful because now you're getting very specific. You're saying, I'm measuring these things because they're measuring engagement or they're measuring exposure. And these metrics are available on this channel, which is my website or my YouTube channel, and they're in this format. It's useful because sometimes you might have a stakeholder that say, we need to measure conversion. And you say, okay, well, how are we measuring it? Are we measuring it based on a number-based metric like total leads, total transactions, or do you want a conversion rate? So again, this is just pushing you towards thinking more comprehensively or more thoroughly about what you should measure and how. So it's optional for you. It does take a little bit longer to indicate this, but I do find that if your team is a little bit newer to this process, it is very helpful. And finally, after you've indicated the metric format, the last thing we're going to do is begin shortlisting our really important metrics, which is our hygiene metrics and KPIs. The way we're going to do this is we're just going to indicate the metric by dragging this little badge onto the relevant metrics. And so this is an example of what that looks like. In this case, you can see I've identified a few of these as hygiene metrics. So my page scroll for my website under engagement was one of my hygiene metrics, as was this average view duration. But we've got a KPI here, which was total sessions on the microsite, as well as total PR coverage, total amount of clippings or coverage from PR. So what I've done here is I've shortlisted the really important metrics and put a stake in the ground to say, these are the ones that are really clear measures of campaign success. And if you're doing this in a group setting, this is definitely a discussion. This is where you're all sitting together looking at this on hopefully a big screen and saying, okay, what is a key measure of success? Let's go with this and let's discuss it a little bit and explain our justification for why these are key metrics that we should be tracking. And so the last step here is to take all this information after you've shortlisted your hygiene metrics and KPIs and put it into something I call a campaign measurement summary. And this just has all the information baked in. The metrics, the channels that those metrics are associated with, as well as the data source, the category of that metric, whether it's a platform engineered or derived metric, all the way down to the role. Is it a KPI or hygiene metric? And optionally, if you have benchmarks from past campaigns, you can drop those in to know what is a good measure of success. But if you don't have relevant campaigns, that's okay. You can just say not applicable. And you can also add a target. So as an example, if you know that your historical CPM is 85 cents, you can say, well, for this campaign, I want to achieve 70 cents per CPM. So I want to improve that a little bit. This document is really, really useful to get aligned on and signed off before your campaign starts. Because what I often have observed in the past is marketers trying to defend metrics when the campaign is done. What ends up happening is they're giving a presentation of campaign performance after everything's done, and they end up getting stuck explaining what some metrics are, what they mean, why they were chosen, rather than explaining how the campaign actually did. So if you go through this process and get a document like this signed off before the campaign starts, everyone is aligned. And it means that when the campaign is done, you can focus on measurement and actually learning from your performance rather than justifying why certain decisions were made. In this template, I've got a little symbol library for you here. So you can easily go and grab one of these sticky notes and copy and paste them and throw them on the board and start giving them names. So like engagement rate. And aside from the symbol library, I also have this full template, which you can use. So you can easily duplicate this and start using it for your own campaigns. And again, remember, I made it so that you can easily kind of just add, remove additional channel lanes. So it's very, very easy for you to use. So this is my metrics planning framework. There's a lot of important concepts for you to learn there. And I have a couple of articles on my website that explain some of these concepts, like the metric categories, which you can read more about. But the Miro board is designed to be very step-by-step and easy for you to go through. And you may not have to go through all these steps once you become more seasoned and more experienced. You can kind of skip steps. But this is a very good process to go through when you have a team that's a little bit less comfortable with data or measurement, or if you find yourself regularly defending why metrics were chosen or trying to educate people on what metrics mean at the end of the campaign. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed the video, and good luck with the metrics planning for your next campaign. Thanks for watching.